Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for this invitation to share my thoughts with you at the final session of IPS Singapore Perspectives Seminar 2020. This year's topic is politics. In many places, this is almost a dirty word, often associated with power contests for one's personal benefit, or worse, being associated with corruption. Hence, not surprisingly, in many of these places, many of the most capable and committed have hesitated to come forth into political service. However, politics in Singapore should really be about governance. Governance is fundamentally about improving the lives of our people and allowing them the best opportunity to fulfill their potential and aspirations. So this afternoon, the question before us is, how can we build a political system and culture in Singapore that will keep us going, growing, and glowing? This is so that our people can continue to improve our lives and realize our expectations. But this is not easy. Many other societies are fracturing under the stresses and strains of various forces. For Singapore, we face another major challenge as an open society where external forces will always penetrate and permeate our society to try to influence our choices and direction. Unlike many other countries, unlike many other bigger countries, we do not have the geographical, historical, linguistic, or cultural buffers against many of these external forces. So to catalyze today's discussion, I will propose 3 hypotheses for consideration on how we can remain exceptional amidst these global and local developments. So the first hypothesis is this: to remain exceptional and keep going, we must have a political DNA that inclines us to constructive solutioning and positive actions beyond rhetoric and debate. Some define democracy too narrowly as a contention and strife among opposing and competing ideologies. Others suggest that the mark of success is about the quantity of different voices and representations in the legislature or society. I think these definitions are inadequate. Beyond plurality, any functioning political system must have reasoned debate based on facts that lead to concrete actions and plans to better the lives of our people. What distinguishes us in Singapore is the second part of the sentence, that beyond reasoned debate based on facts, we need concrete plans and actions to better the lives of our people. And this is the essence of SG Together. Today, in this digital age of fake news and alternative reality, this simple task has never been harder. Beyond plurality, there must be mechanisms to allow the diversity of ideas and the divergence of perspectives to finally lead to convergence for action. This is the true test of democracy in action. Today, in many societies and democracies, we indeed see plurality and diversity in debate. But we have yet to see many societies where all these lead to convergence in action. Instead, increasingly we see compromises and consideration for the broader societal interests giving way to narrow sectoral interests. The result being that the longer-term interests of the future generations are often sacrificed. We will really have to ask ourselves this: what sort of politics we want in Singapore, especially if Singapore is to be around forever, not just for the next 4 to 5 years. Hypothesis number 2. To remain exceptional and keep growing, we will need to have the gumption to evolve our political system to stay relevant with the needs of time. Now, this is a very difficult task, but the lack of evolution in any system almost inevitably leads to revolution. So in the Singapore context, how to evolve our systems to anticipate and preempt problems, even when it is politically inconvenient and politically not expedient. Can maturity, in our case, not be a prelude to ossification, decrepitude, and finally collapse? I will posit that the answer to these questions are as important as who we choose to lead us within the existing system. Hypothesis number 3. To remain exceptional and keep glowing beyond culture and structure, the final piece must be the ethos of political leadership. How do we inspire and bring forth teams of people who are capable, committed, and with conviction? That means we need good and real political leaders and not just politicians for the short haul. We have been lucky over the last 6 decades, but maintaining the right ethos of political service will never be easy, especially in times of peace and abundance. We can all be easily lulled into complacency, thinking that all will be well. Or we think that someone else can and should do the job. Or ask, why should it be me to undertake this thankless task? But this issue goes beyond political leadership. It actually applies to leadership at all levels of our society. We all see ourselves as fellow Singaporeans with the same shared responsibility to seek solutions for the challenges that we face, anticipate the challenges that we face, and put in place systems, structures, organizations, culture ahead of time to preempt those challenges. So on that note, let me pause and hear your thoughts for us to continue the discussion. True political service requires leadership and stewardship for this generation and for the future generations. The emphasis is on service and not politics. May we all work together as one united team to keep Singapore going, growing, and glowing. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Minister. Thank you for your time today. I'm Aidan. I'm a student from Year 1 US College, and I'm also a member of SG Climate Rally. You mentioned that we want SG to be around forever. I would like that too, but in order for that to happen, we must reverse the climate emergency that we're seeing today. And so as Minister for Trade and Industry, I wanted to ask how Singapore intends to confront the elephant in the room, which is our large fossil fuel industry that we host, given that we want to be responsible and pull our weight in dealing with the climate crisis as well. Thank you.
Yes, we have a big petrochemical industry, but we also have to be realistic. How is our petrochemical industry performing? In fact, this is one of the things that when we went to the Paris treaty discussions, for a small country like us, we felt very much done in. Because of the size of our GDP, population, geographical area, we have that much quota. Our petchem industry is one of the most efficient, one of the cleanest in the whole industry. And we benchmark ourselves. If you know the terminology, they will do the first quota, second quota, third quota, and then benchmark. Most of our industries are in the first quarter. But the carbon budget is counted against us rather than the consumer. If tomorrow we don't produce, so we ask the people in the discussion room, tomorrow if we don't produce, where would all these same petrochemicals be produced? They will be produced somewhere else in the world. And more likely also to be under conditions which are perhaps more pollutive than the current conditions. But we do have this issue. So notwithstanding that, we take our carbon responsibilities very seriously. There are industries that may want to come into Singapore and which we may not be able to even accept them. So I give you an example. Singapore is a data hub. Many internet companies, many digital companies would like to set up their data centers in Singapore. But data centers require huge amount of energy. Huge amount of energy requires huge amount of carbon budget. Are we able to attract those? If we are unable to attract those, what does it mean for our economy, our position as a global hub for the digital services? Now, these are difficult questions that cannot be answered just because we are philosophically wedded to one consideration and not the rest. In fact, in all such difficult decisions, we have to ask ourselves, how do we remain competitive as an economy to attract those investments, create good jobs for our people? How do we fulfill our carbon budget obligations, not just for this generation, for the next generation? How do we have sufficient energy supplies for Singapore? And life is fair. In Singapore, we don't have earthquake, we don't have typhoon. That means that we have no geothermal, we have no wind power, and not much. The only thing that we have is solar. However, 80% of the time in Singapore, the skies are overcast. The efficiency of the solar panels when they are working at the current technology level is about 20 to 25% for the best of class. So what can we do to unlock the energy constraint, or rather the carbon constraint, for the next 50 years so that we can continue to attract the industries, create good jobs for our people, and yet at the same time manage our future carbon budget? Number one, think of how we can diversify our energy sources. So we have gone from oil and gas to LNG, which is one of the cleanest fossil fuel. Number two, we can significantly try to improve our solar panel coverage. In fact, I think by the end of this year, if I'm not wrong, we have 1 in every 2 HDB flat with at least some solar panel, and we will try to scale as much as we can, right? So those are what I call supply. But we need to manage the demand as well. I always ask ourselves how we can reduce significantly the energy consumption for cooling needs. 1/3 of our energy consumption goes to cooling needs for the residential and commercial. So we are going to, that's why during the Energy Week, we have set off a grand challenge for Singaporeans to come up with ideas on how we can reduce our energy consumption in order for us to release the constraint for us to still have our fair share of industries and so forth. Now, finally, your question is that, are we thinking of a post-fossil fuel future? Yes, we are. Because we know where the trend of the world is going, right? We are just one small part on the global economy. Many of the big companies, be it ExxonMobil, be it Shell, and so forth, they are all thinking of a future beyond fossil fuels. How fast we can get there? It all depends on how fast we are able to adopt those technologies. But are we thinking about it? Yes, certainly. But when the time comes, it will mean that our economic structures will fundamentally be quite different. It means that the type of jobs that we can create for our own people will be quite different. And all this will not be able to be done overnight, because as you shift the industry structure, we must have a care about the jobs that are being displaced, and these are jobs that many of our people are working in. So yes, we are looking at that, and we are thinking of how to make sure that we insulate ourselves against all these difficult problems that may come and confront us. But we can all do something to unlock the energy and carbon puzzle that's confronting us today.
Hi, Minister Chan. My name is Walid, and I'm from NTU. I am heartened by your call for us to have more gumption to evolve the political system. So in the spirit of providing constructive suggestions beyond rhetoric and debate, I would like to run by two suggestions with you to evolve the political system. Firstly, is it possible for us to have an independent electoral boundaries review committee, one that is not under the purview of the Prime Minister's office and not chaired by the Secretary to the Prime Minister? The second one is about the GRCs. Can we have a reduction in the size of GRCs to a maximum of a two-person GRC? Because if the motivation, if the intention is minority representation, we do not need beyond two people in a particular GRC. Thank you.
So the EBRC, the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee, they are formed by the civil servants who have knowledge on things like demographics and all that kind of things. I never doubt their independence. They do their job professionally. They report to the CAPSEC, okay, as a formal matter of procedure. Because no matter who does the work, how it's done, you have to report to somebody and present it to be approved and then to be issued, right? So I never doubt the work of the EBRC, and I don't think the civil servants will be so unprofessional as to take into account considerations beyond their remit. As to your second question, I think the Prime Minister have said this before, and I'll just repeat here. The Prime Minister, I think, after the last GE, have said that, well, he would give instructions to the EBRC to see how we can have smaller GRCs and more SMCs. So I'll wait for the EBRC's work to be done before we make any comments as to what it is. But that the Prime Minister has gone on record to say that.
I'm Ko Tai An from NTU, Center for Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. My question moves away from the material to the issue of language and identity. You mentioned one of your themes is evolution and change with regard to current policies. And the language policies were crafted at a time where historical circumstances and other circumstances were different. And I'm wondering whether you are thinking about bringing them up to date because they contain a lot of contradictions. A consequence of our leaving Malaysia and our choice of multiracialism was that English language became the linchpin of multiracialism. As a result, the national language Malay became symbolic. A contradiction here is that bilingualism is very narrowly defined. It's mother tongue and English. We live in a neighborhood which is largely Malay, and we have a large Malay minority. So why is not this choice available now? Okay, right. The next contradiction is, this is a majority Chinese population, and it was decided that Mandarin is our mother tongue. The reality is Mandarin is that which was used by the Chinese educated in the Chinese educated system. For many people, their real mother tongue is really their dialects. To promote Mandarin, dialects were suppressed, repressed, and the result is a repression, a suppression, a psychic depression, right, of people who spoke dialect, and for the younger generation, a sense of cultural loss. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be an important question. But in times of crisis, when identity politics come in, this could be very important. Thank you.
Actually, you are right. I agree with you. The circumstances which we are facing now and then is quite different. We chose English as the language which is the common for all of us, partly because it is not used by any particular linguistic group, as you mentioned. But there's also a very practical reason, and that's our ability to connect to the rest of the world, because English is the language of business in the rest of the world for a large part of the world. On one hand, we want to unite our people. On the other hand, we want to be able to connect with the rest of the world. On the third policy objective is that we all want our children to grow up having some understanding of their roots, which is why the mother tongue came in, be it Malay, Chinese, or Tamil, right? The question which is before us is, then what is a practical way forward? Today, because of the rise of China, because Chinese has become economically more useful, there are many people taking up Chinese seriously in schools and even beyond schools for economic reasons. So that has changed. compared to the past whereby in the 60s and 70s, before the sharp rise in the Chinese economic heft, people were perhaps not so seized with learning the language. If you ask me, for those who are capable, I encourage everyone to learn as many languages as you can. But I know how tough it is to master one language, if not two, and definitely more difficult than three. I myself went through this journey. My family doesn't speak English. For me, until today, people laugh at my English. With a funny twang, I don't speak as polished as other people. But that's my background, so I tried. In my home, we watch Chinese programs. So I think in Chinese and convert them into English. That's why sometimes when the media interview me, they think I'm speaking in Chinese when I'm actually speaking to them in English. My late grandmother knew neither English nor Chinese. So she spoke to me in Cantonese throughout. I learned my multiplication table in Cantonese. Today, when I think about mathematical concepts, I think in Cantonese. That's very complicated. But having said that, I think my posture is this. All of us learn English to try to connect ourselves and connect with the world. All of us go learn a mother tongue to the extent that we can to keep our roots and understand where we come from. All of us, to those who are more capable, take a third language, whether is it Bahasa Melayu, Bahasa Indonesia, Japanese, German, French, whatever. If you are, I encourage you to do so. Because it will make the Singaporean much more competitive in the global economy to be able to connect to the rest of the world. But I don't think it will be possible for us to insist that everybody master so many languages.
I'm Cheng Hao from Temasek Junior College. I just want to ask about your long-term vision for Singapore. Being cognizant of global uncertainty, be it politically, socially, or economically, where do you see Singapore in the next 20 to 30 years?
My long-term vision in Singapore is not just the next 20 and 30 years. It's not just the next 20 and 30 years. I grew up in a system, in a part of the system where I understand that the last 50 over years of our existence has been an aberration in the history of Singapore and the history of this part of the world. If we go back a few hundred years, Singapore has never been independent, and some would argue Singapore has never been allowed to be independent. Never been independent because as a small city-state, without a natural conventional hinterland, it is very difficult to survive. Without those external links for resources, supplies, markets, talent, and so forth, it's very difficult. So I never take it as a given that we will arrive at SG 100 effortlessly. Never. When it comes to the social issues, we have succeeded on many fronts. But the challenges are ongoing. In the past, we were equally poor. Today, we are unequally rich. The challenges are no less. In the past, everybody feels that they have a chance to rise up to the top. And today, we pride ourselves still that amongst all the societies that we see, Singapore is probably the best place to be born, even if we don't come from a privileged background, because we have every reason to believe that we can succeed. But that is not to be taken for granted. Every country, as they mature, ossify. They form groups, and after a while, there will be groups that ask themselves, why should I continue to support this system if I cannot get ahead in this system? Those are our ongoing challenges. So what's my vision? I only have one simple vision for my entire life work, be it in the SAF, MSF, NTUC, or now MTI. I have one very simple aim. And that is for Singapore to defy the odds of history, that we will define a future where the future is in our hands and we are not beholden to others nor held ransom by others. That when others ask us to jump, we don't have to only ask how high, but we can ask why. Is it easy? No, I don't think so. Is it easy? No. My wife asked me, why do you continue to be where you are? Every day you are getting all the brickbats. Your family is getting the brickbats. Your children are getting the brickbats. Why are we still here? And I can tell you, we are still here. I am still here because I want my children and my grandchildren, and for many more generations to come, to be able to call themselves Singaporeans. That they have the means to be called Singaporeans, and they have the gumption to be called Singaporean, the will. That today, we may just be Singaporeans, but one day, there will be a Singapore tribe. That's why for the bicentennial, I like it so much when Indrani proposed the tagline, from Singapore to Singaporeans. There's the double meaning to it. From Singapore, a geographical location, to Singaporean, a people. A people united by a set of values, although we may not be having a common ancestry, race, language, religion. But Singapore to Singaporeans is also about our stewardship to leave behind something better for the next generation. Just as the previous generation have left us with what we have today. That every generation of Singaporeans will not fear because they will start from a higher platform to scale a higher peak. That every generation will lend our shoulders to the next to stand taller and see further. And if we can continue to do that, I'm not worried about SG 100. I will say that even beyond SG 100, we will continue to shine. So what's my vision for Singapore? Defy the odds of history. Show the world how a small city-state without natural resources, without a common ancestry, can come together, value add to the world, contribute to the world, and bring forth people with a common set of values and vision, and not just looking at the past. That is our life's work. You ask Wicked, I think you'll be the same answer. That's what unites us in this endeavor to make sure that there will be a Singapore that all our children and future generations that can be proud of.
Duverger, a French political scientist, have this very interesting hypothesis. He argued, okay, let me read. The dominant party wears itself out in office. It loses its vigor, its arteries harden. It would thus be possible to show that every domination bears within itself the seeds of its own destruction. So is it a done deal that the PAP will still be the ruling party 2 or 3 decades from now? The PAP seem to have defied Duverger's prediction thus far. Look at Congress Party of India, a perennial one-party dominant, gone. Across the causeway, UMNO is in the opposition now. The party which I spent a lot of time examining, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, in power from 1955 till 1993, out, back in power in 1994, and between 2009 to 2012, it was in the opposition. Okay, so it's interesting. Is the PAP going to be the last perennial one party in the world? I would argue quality of the leaders, ability to attract talent, and the smooth passing of the baton, political baton. That's why we have 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, question mark. Okay? The institutions, norms, and blueprint of governance established by the old guard, I think it resonated with the electorate. If these values are not embraced by Singapore citizens, I think they would have been thrown out of office. Successful economic stewardship, and I dare say that for the majority of voters in Singapore, they do find life in Singapore rather tolerable, very good for some, on the whole. Even if there are unhappiness with specific public policies, such as public transportation, problems with our trains, and immigration policies. The other thing to note is the PAP is really, really impressive at the grassroots. No? Singaporeans, with any problems, you're going to see your MP, I don't think you leave empty-handed if you are really, truly in need. So PAP is a very, very disciplined cadre party. It's not faction-ridden, although some people joke that it is a Leninist party, you know, democratic centralism. The advantage of perennial rule by the PAP, symbiotic ties with the state machinery, NTUC, strong influence on media, and it had extended its hegemonic values to society. I don't think it's just propaganda, coercion, you know, but many Singaporeans actually embraced the values which I mentioned, articulated by the old guard. The question mark is, can we maintain unity in diversity? Unity in diversity without leading to fragmentation and fissures in our society. And obviously, the PAP must evolve and adapt. Likewise, opposition parties. Okay, food for thought. PAP's hegemonic control of political narratives and facts. POFMA was mentioned a few times this morning. Will it be effective? Could you imagine in future elections, if you have opposition parties, civil societies, individuals making all kinds of statements, how are we going to enforce it? Will the high courts be overloaded? Are we going to go after them selectively? PMET problem. How are we going to address rising social inequality? Now, social inequality is something which is endemic across the board. Singapore is so globalized, can we escape from global trends of social inequality? And can political parties attract the support of millennials? My daughter is a millennial. I mean, she thinks very differently from me. You know? So, I mean, good luck to Mr. Heng Swee Keat and PAP, because how are you going to convince the millennials? Big challenge. Will the PAP leadership remain united in the post-Lee Hsien Loong era? Can PAP afford a team B without splitting, without tearing itself apart? You look at the talent pool of the PAP, look at the MPs, the activists, very impressive. Is there no space for team B? Now, this may be a bit controversial, political elitism. I will qualify it by saying that I cannot come across any political systems in the world where there are no elites. It's a matter of degree. But in case of Singapore, can the PAP's governance evolve from a small elite circle to greater political participation and transparency in governance? Can the PAP, in the decades ahead, avoid divergence theory, divergence trap, that all dominant political parties are doomed to be thrown out of power? Is that the fate of the PAP?
I'll start by highlighting three relatively stable factors that I believe are unlikely to change in the coming election. They're not big surprises, but I think it might be useful to know these things to frame our discussion. First, the opposition is not a government in waiting. Furthermore, that's not what most voters expect from them. They function as a potential check on the ruling party, a means for citizens to exert pressure on the PAP government. The dominant party context helps explain why most voters do not expect the opposition to have fully formed platforms with detailed policy proposals. The PAP, understandably, finds this very frustrating. It has criticized such voting behavior as irresponsible and warns that this is opposition for opposition's sake. Nevertheless, many voters will continue to use their vote as a way to deliver a desired level of check and balance. The second given is that the opposition parties will not form any grand coalition. Minor parties may team up, but big ones won't. At most, they will enter into minor pacts to avoid three-cornered fights. Opposition disunity is a reflection of voters' own lack of consensus about the kind of political competition they want. Different voters are attracted to different types of opposition. Therefore, there is no single proven formula for both satisfying hardcore opposition voters while at the same time attracting swing voters, first-time voters, and loyal PAP voters who may be tempted to defect. The third constant that we should bear in mind is that the opposition will continue to benefit from the underdog advantage. Singapore voters may not have a great appetite for multi-party democracy, but they do have an innate sense of fair play. The opposition plays the underdog card well, and the government seems to know this. Thanks to the underdog advantage, voters will give opposition candidates some leeway as long as they do not have disqualifying deficits. The underdog advantage also means that attacks on the opposition may backfire if they are perceived as over the top. Remember how the WP raised $1 million in 3 days through just one online post. This is a sign the PAP cannot ignore. Now, let me turn very quickly to the unknowns, the new and less predictable factors in this election. First, I think who really has the upper hand in the online battle for hearts and minds? For a long time, we have assumed that the untamed territory of cyberspace is ruled by opponents of the PAP. But the ruling party and the government were not sitting idly by, especially after the 2011 election. Government ministers and agencies developed a major official Facebook presence. By the 2015 election, these efforts were already significant. Former IPS scholar Tan Hao noted that we were seeing, quote-unquote, a normalization of cyberspace. By this, he meant that Singapore's online space was beginning to resemble offline space. That is, largely middle-of-the-road opinions with anti-government voices on the fringe. Just like in the real world, the government's voice was beginning to be among the loudest in the virtual world. I think the second game changer in this election is the Tan Cheng Bock factor. Major opposition parties have done well to attract credible candidates, including those that the PAP might have also considered to be attractive candidates. But I think it is Tan Cheng Bock's entry into opposition ranks that is groundbreaking. He was no ordinary backbencher. He was a trusted CEC member. The question is whether he will pave the way for others. Dr. Tan has cast himself as someone who wants to reclaim the old PAP. The question is whether there are enough people who can tell the difference between the old and the current. Now, the third uncertainty is about how economic and geopolitical conditions will influence voters. In most countries, the state of economy is the best predictor of elections. The greater the economic turbulence, the more the people are likely to want to vote against the government of the day. In Singapore, it is different. Because of the PAP's status of the national party of government, Singaporeans have contradictory feelings towards the PAP. When times are bad, they may blame the PAP, and yet they may treat the PAP as a safe haven. This is the inner conflict of many swing voters especially. In the coming election, the opposition may well gain from slower economic growth. Or voters may heed the PAP call for order and stability at a time of leadership transition.
I was asked on how bilateral relations, which I take more generally as international relations, affects Singapore politics. Well, the most important foreign policy decision we have ever taken was to join Malaysia. It was also the most serious foreign policy miscalculation we have ever made. And in that apparent paradox lies the genesis of independent Singapore's politics. Speaking in the Singapore Legislative Assembly on 5th March 1957, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, and I quote, "In the context of the second half of the 20th century Southeast Asia, island nations are a political joke. A political joke." Now, Mr. Lee made that statement during a debate on the constitutional talks in government. It reflected his conviction and the conviction of his comrades that merger with Malaya was the only practical way forward if Singapore were to completely shake off colonial rule. We all know what happened after merger. And what made it impossible for us to remain in Malaysia ultimately amounted to a point of political philosophy. In the terminology of the day, was it to be a Malaysian Malaysia or a Malay Malaysia? Our first generation leadership perhaps underestimated the vehemence with which the Malay leadership in Malaysia clung to the notion of Ketuanan Melayu, Malay dominance. Consequently, they underestimated the extent to which their vision of a Malaysian Malaysia, based on values we now call multiracial meritocracy, was unacceptable to the Malaysian Malay leadership. And the fundamental incompatibility of these concepts is still the basic driving force underlying bilateral relations with Malaysia, and in a slightly different way, Indonesia too. Having risked an unexpectedly independent Singapore becoming a political joke over this value, we had to make the value work, and so we are still here. The Singapore story is the story of the government and people refusing to meekly await their fate, but instead defiantly exercising the agency that is never entirely absent, even in the most daunting of circumstances, to ensure that the values for which we risked everything would succeed. That imperative shaped our politics and society. My key point is that there is always agency. There is always something that can be done. Politics, whether of the domestic or foreign variety, is about using the agency that is never entirely absent, even in the most dire of circumstances, to preserve, defend, and advance the essential values on which our society is based and which is our unique value proposition. We cannot be just like everybody else. If a small country is just like every other country, it risks becoming irrelevant, a political joke. In broad outline, the essential problems that we now face are enhanced 21st century iterations of issues that we have faced down before. We were able to do so because our first generation leaders were a rare mixture, a rare blend of political skill and technocratic competence. That is why Singapore succeeded when so many other countries that gained independence around the same time floundered in the face of similar challenges. As Singapore prospered, politics receded. But we are now entering a period, and I think it will be a lengthy period, when leadership will again require a melding of political skill and technocratic competence. And so the lessons of our early political history are more relevant than ever and need to be re-emphasized.
What I do in this context is to look at how internet pop culture relates to the idea of everyday politics. If we were to look at influencers who primarily serve as your amplification platforms, it's great that they're giving us a vocabulary and a sense of urgency to talk about race, gender, sexuality, and the like. But we must also remember that some of the most popular YouTube channels or networks in Singapore that are run by Chinese youth, you often see that they use minority or fringe identities as a punchline. Meme factories in the same way who have been helping us with a conversation about normalizing the things that we find difficult to talk about. You also want to think about the sources, the agenda, and who is channeling all of this information to us. Lastly, with network threats, well, they do a very good job in surfacing issues that we would normally let fly under the radar or not care about. We also want to be aware of mob mentality. What should we make of everyday politics and internet pop culture? The first is, do not belittle the format. As much as it comes across as funny, frivolous, and humor, it is relatable and it reaches audiences that you can never imagine. And finally, don't underestimate the authority of where these sources come from. They may not seem like the most learned, most certified people, but the networks of their power and their information are extremely dispersed, and when they consolidate, that's where you really see the subversive power of them all. Thank you.
Most of my work is geographically specific to two neighborhoods, Geylang and Dakota Crescent. What we really want to do is to build bridges and not walls, and also look at how we as citizens can find the good in everybody. To love our neighbors, the question is always what kind of norms do we want to create as citizens? And with people who care, how do we get people to also know about these norms and allow these new norms to sit well within our population? And it first has to start from ourselves. So we need new role models who exemplify the values that we want to see in our society. From a 3-year-old child to MPs of different constituencies who value efforts of those who keep our estates clean, whether local or foreigners, or to the ordinary Singaporeans who open up their hearts by opening up their homes. We look to these social issues not just as issues in their own silo, but as mirrors which reflect the values of our society. So the dream is really to move beyond the economic but social and environmental perceptions that we have, and also to find the non-Googleables in our neighborhoods through the conversations that we've had, whether amongst our friends in schools or workplaces, to see communities as social ecosystems interdependent on one another, and starting from humanizing the narrative to find strength in diversity and perhaps beyond the labels that we put on one another, to talk to one another, and let's stop talking about one another. Thank you.
To give a brief background about the women that we work with, these are the demographics. They belong to the bottom 10% socioeconomic class in Singapore, of whom 80% of them have secondary school or lower education. 40% of them are single mothers, 80% are from ethnic minority groups, and about a fifth of them are migrant mothers on long-term visit pass. So they range from having 2 to 9 children, and the span of their age that come through our doors range from 20 to their 50s and 60s. And well, they all fall below the $650 per capita income per month that qualifies them for the ComCare financial assistance. I learned that poverty was actually an issue beyond just finances, and that it depletes people in many ways beyond that. The first thing I realized as to why women were not coming to programs by various workforce agencies was that they didn't even have enough money to pay for bus fare. The other thing was they could have wanted to come out for workshops, but looking at the stats of how many children they have and the fact that half of them are single mothers, they really lack the family support or other kinds of childcare support to allow them to actually attend any kind of skills upgrading or employability kind of programs. So we also noticed that amongst the women that we serve, at least 25% or 27% of them suffer from some form of mental health problems, including anxiety, depression, and uniformly, all of them suffered from very low self-confidence and self-esteem. And I think as a community and as policymakers, I hope that we can encourage us to think about the low-income community as not just needy or deserving only of financial aid, but they truly deserve our financial investment to help them fulfill all their potential and to help them with social mobility.
I would just like to highlight there can be many different conversations as to what good politics is, and there can be many different angles in terms of freedom of expression or barriers to entry. For me, in the climate context here in Singapore, good politics means having a healthy ecosystem where all the key stakeholders, all the ground-up groups, agencies like NYC, MURA, and so on, can come together and we can talk out things with each other, building that trust and partnership, which was earlier mentioned this morning. I think for me, one thing is clear. Regardless of your political affiliation, the climate crisis should be at the top of your agenda, and the incumbent should call for national unity when co-creating policies for the climate crisis. Mr. Chiam See Tong, he mentioned this in 1984 after the electoral victory. I think this also is appropriate in our current context. He mentioned, whenever possible, we will cooperate with the PAP and find solutions to the problems. I want to help PAP in its responsibility of nation building. So here, regardless of your political leanings and role in society, be it in the government or NGO, I hope you see that the larger cause here is really to work towards a better Singapore. So put aside your differences and work with each other more. Thank you.